Hi everyone, I'm MissV. Today we are diving into Buddhism, a philosophy many people have heard of, but not everyone truly understands. Today I will walk you through the essence of Buddhism. When the Buddha first taught, he started with suffering. Why? Because suffering is something everyone can relate to. Life is full of challenges, and every day we feel the weight of them. Naturally, we want to know, where does suffering come from? Can it be avoided, or at least reduced? That's why understanding suffering is the first step to understanding Buddhism. The Buddha talked about 3 kinds of suffering. First, ordinary suffering. Ordinary suffering is the obvious stuff like getting a headache, losing a job, or seeing a loved one in the hospital. Second, suffering due to change. Suffering due to change is a kind of suffering that hides inside what we think is happiness. For example, falling in love feels amazing at first, but later, arguments or even breakups bring pain. Or think about eating ice cream. It's a sweet joy in the moment, but later it turns into extra weight you don't want. That's the suffering when pleasure eventually changes into pain. Third, existential suffering. Existential suffering is the deeper unease of life itself, because everything is impermanent and nothing stays fixed. It's a sense of being trapped in the cycle of life, never fully satisfied, always bound by worries or frustrations, even in the smallest moments. More specifically, human suffering is further divided into 8 kinds. They include birth, aging, sickness, and death. Those are things none of us can escape. Then there's the suffering of being stuck with the people you dislike, the suffering of being separated from those you love, the suffering of not getting what you want. And even when you do get what you want, you may soon realize you don't want it anymore. And finally, the suffering of facing things you don't want. Together, those 8 sufferings cover almost every struggle we experience in life. So why do we start with suffering? At first, admitting that suffering is universal might sound negative or even pessimistic. But it's not. Avoiding suffering only makes our anxiety and fear worse. Accepting suffering as normal allows us to focus on solving the problem itself instead of wasting energy on resentment. Think about how much time we spend being angry, feeling wronged, or asking, why me? I shouldn't have to go through this. When your mind keeps repeating this is unfair, this shouldn't have happened, or if only it hadn't happened, everything would be fine, you end up exhausting yourself by refusing to accept reality. That's why Buddhism starts with suffering. It is not here to make us hopeless, it is here to help us see clearly. Once you understand that suffering is inevitable, the 3 kinds of suffering and the 8 kinds of suffering exist, you see it is simply part of life. When it happens, and what matters is what you do next, how you handle it, how you deal with it, and how you move things in a better direction. It helps you not get stuck in the emotions. That is what really eases the pain. And learning about suffering is not about escaping it. It is about facing it head on. The more you face the suffering, the simpler it becomes. But if you spend all day wishing the suffering had not happened, it will cling to you even harder and leave you more trapped and frustrated. So in one sentence, if a problem can be solved, there is no need to worry. And if it cannot be solved, worrying will not help. In my previous video, Life is Just One Thing, we mentioned that people are sometimes worse than mice. Look at a little white mouse in a maze. When it hits a wall once, it immediately turns around. If the right path does not work, next time it tries the left. But people do not do that. When they hit a wall, they complain the wall shouldn't be there, or they insist on tearing it down, and they barely think of simply turning another way. That is a human problem, clinging too deeply, so deeply that we cannot see what is happening right in front of us. We only believe the stories in our own heads. So we should learn from the mouse, let go and turn right away. So why do we cling so tightly and end up so anxious and afraid? The Buddha said it's because we resist impermanence. What is impermanence? Everything in this world goes through arising, staying, changing, and disappearing. Nothing lasts forever. When you realize that life is impermanent, you see that nothing around you will stay the same. Think about this. Just a few years ago, who could have imagined AI would advance this far? Elon Musk even said that within 20 years, all jobs might be replaced by AI, and already many people have lost their jobs. And it's not just technology. You will grow older for sure. Your friends may move away. Your children will grow up and leave home. These are signs of impermanence. But when we refuse to accept these changes will happen, that's when anxiety takes over. We long to go back to the time before anything changed, and then longing itself becomes suffering. Impermanence isn't something you go through, it's the whole of your life. The Buddha taught that the root of our suffering lies in the deep misunderstanding we carry about ourselves and the world around us. Because we mistake illusions for reality, we cling to things as they were fixed and permanent. But in truth, everything arises and faded depending on conditions. Because of this, nothing has a fixed identity. That's what Buddha calls no self. And nothing lasts forever, that's impermanence. For example, you don't have some permanent essence, that's no self. And even your existence in this world isn't certain, that's impermanence. The problem is, when we fail to recognize no self and impermanence, we often blame impermanence itself for our suffering. We think pain comes from change, but in reality, it's not impermanence that hurts us. It's our fear of change, our fear of impermanence that hurt us. So how do we overcome that fear? There are two ways. One way is to become familiar with impermanence. We can observe it and accept it. The other way is to understand the roots of that fear. When you face impermanence directly, you realize you are not the only one losing something. You are not the only one aging. You are not the only one getting sick. You are not the only one struggling. Everyone shares the same reality. And also sometimes, the things that makes us happiest can slowly turn into pain. I recently heard a true story that really touches me. There was a young man who secretly loved his colleague for 7 years. Every day he brought her coffee and snacks, walked with her on her way to and from work, and felt those were the happiest moments of his life. But one day, she stopped replying to his messages. Soon, he found out she had been in a relationship with another colleague for a long time, and had recently married and was now pregnant. In that moment, his heart completely broke. For 7 years, he devoted himself only to her, even giving up all other relationships. One day, he offered her a gift. She said it was too valuable and refused. He broke down in tears, begging her to take it, because to him it carried all the love and feelings he had held on to for 7 years. Later, he visited her family, and her mother handed him 2 apples, as if wishing him peace. Back home, he couldn't sleep for days. The first thing he did was listen to Buddhist scriptures, and the second thing was quietly eating those 2 apples with tears in his eyes. It's really a heartbreaking story. This is exactly what Buddhism calls suffering due to change, something that begins as great happiness but eventually turns into pain. The Buddha said that happiness simply means when suffering comes to an end. So letting go of attachment is also happiness. If we don't tie our joy to the fleeting stimulation of the outside world. then that feeling of happiness can actually last and even grow. Because happiness is really just an inner experience. People often think they are unhappy, but in reality, if you sit here quietly right now, you can already feel a gentle sense of joy. And if we can observe our thoughts as we notice wrinkles on our face, we will realize that every simple, direct movement carries a quiet kind of happiness. Basically, happiness isn't built on outside things, because everything out there keeps changing. It's like money in the stock market. It goes up and down all the time. If your happiness depends on those ups and downs, then your joy will always be fragile. That's why some people can live peacefully even without a permanent home, while others feel trapped and restless inside a luxury room. People always cling tightly to what they already have, even something as small as a book or even as a needle. And at the same time, they keep chasing after what they don't have. But if you can stop being attached to what you own, being willing to let it go, and stop chasing what you don't have, you will discover a sense of peace. That's what non-attachment means. That's what letting go is. And letting go brings happiness. In other words, it's about lightening up a little, not exaggerating negative emotions, not spinning stories in your head that make things even worse. Learn to be gentle with yourself, to show yourself compassion. Because once you can let go of attachment and accept impermanence, you will realize that happiness has been inside you all along.